Hey everyone. So very interesting story that happened today in Jerusalem. The Israeli police, the IDF, and the Jerusalem municipality moved into a compound called Kafr Aqab and began taking it away from UNRWA. Remember UNRWA? The United Nations Relief Works Agency. That's the last, and this Kafr Aqab compound is the last piece of real estate that the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency still held in the capital, in Jerusalem. And you might have seen a video I made recently about UNRWA. If you saw that, you already know the background. If you didn't, don't worry. I'll catch you up in the next minute or so. For those of you who saw that video, this might be a little bit of review, and then we'll get to what actually happened today because there's a lot packed into this story. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put that previous video about UNRWA, which has a lot of information in it. You don't want to miss that one. I'm going to put it as a pinned comment. I'll make it the first comment in this video. So if you want to really get caught up, you can pause right now and just go watch that video and then come back and watch this one, or you can watch it afterwards. But either way, you want to get caught up fully on the UNRWA story. And, you know, very often in these videos, when I'm talking about some news item, I'll say, we're going to be watching this and we'll follow up on it. Well, here I'm following up on this story. Okay, so here's the quick background. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, is the UN agency that has handled Palestinian refugee affairs since 1949. So they run schools and clinics, and they protect this refugee status that, unlike every other refugee population on earth, gets passed down generation after generation instead of ever being resolved. Watch the previous video. After October 7th, it came out that like a dozen UNRWA employees were directly implicated in the October 7th massacres. That's right, they participated. And separately, UN Watch uncovered a Telegram channel, a Telegram group, of roughly 3,000 UNRWA employees, some of whom were celebrating the October 7th attacks in real time as they were happening. So in October 2024, the Knesset responded by passing a law by a very lopsided margin. 92 members voted for it. Remember, the coalition is only like 64 or whatever it was at the time, around there. So it basically there was consensus. I mean, remember, it's 92 out of 120 members, and like 10 of the members are from Arab parties that wouldn't vote for it anyway. So this was pretty wall-to-wall consensus. So this law passed, and the law banned UNRWA from operating anywhere Israel claims sovereignty, including Jerusalem. And the law also cut off all contact between UNRWA and any Israeli officials. So that law has been in the background. And if you caught my last video, you'll remember at the time I was covering the news item that the Supreme Court had a hearing because a left-wing NGO called Adala tried to get that law struck down entirely. And the justices signaled pretty clearly that they weren't buying that, and they weren't going to strike down the law. So hold on to that because it's going to matter for what comes later in this video. Okay, so today was the latest chapter in the UNRWA story. So what happened today? So a Kafr Aqab, it sits in the northernmost part of Jerusalem on the far side, on the other side of the separation wall, the barrier, the security barrier that Israel built years ago after the Second Intifada to keep suicide bombers and other attackers from coming in. So they built this security wall, but the security wall isn't a border. Okay, they just built this wall depending on where populations were. Physically, this UNRWA compound is on the other side of that security fence, so it feels like it's outside of Jerusalem, but it's not. Legally, it is in Jerusalem's municipal boundary under Israeli law. Now, on this site, there is something called the Kalandia Training Center. That's what we're going to be talking about for most of this video. That's the site that was in the news today, the Kalandia Training Center. This is UNRWA's oldest vocational training center anywhere in the world. It's 70, and you might wonder, what do I mean by anywhere in the world? UNRWA doesn't only operate in Israel, it also operates in Jordan and in Lebanon. Right? It operates wherever there are Palestinian refugees. So this Kalandia Training Center teaches a few hundred young Arabs trades like vehicle maintenance, plumbing, IT. Okay, so let's take a look at the story. Here is the news item from today. IDF and police evacuate Kafr Aqab UNRWA compound. Okay, so they began on Tuesday to evacuate the UNRWA compound. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir welcomed the move. This morning, Israel police forces are working with the relevant authorities to enforce the law and remove UNRWA from the premises. Remember, he's in charge of the police. So he's saying that, the police are doing this. An organization whose employees were involved in terrorism and repeatedly served as a cover for Hamas has no right to exist for even one more second and has no place in Jerusalem or the state of Israel. My policy is clear. Sovereignty is not something you talk about. It's something you exercise. The Israel police will continue to act resolutely to enforce the law, strengthen governance, and make it clear that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel, and so it will remain. Anyone who establishes terrorist nests there will be removed, Ben-Gvir added. Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that in accordance with my directive and following the law we passed, the evacuation of the UNRWA compound in Kafr Aqab began today. Okay, and then, of course, we're not going to let people who participated on October 7th stay here. According to the police response, at the time, the issue was at an advanced stage. So earlier, this was happening. Earlier this month, the police said that they were having discussions about this, and it was already at an advanced stage. And there was commencement of the work on the site, meaning ahead of this evacuation, they were already getting ready with these plans to start work on this site. Now, what work they were going to be doing, you'll find out later in the video. The police further stated they will continue to work in full operational coordination with the security and enforcement bodies to complete the eviction and work. About a year ago, the Knesset approved that law, 92 members saying that UNRWA can't operate in Israel anymore. Several months later, so several months after the law passed, Israeli security forces carried out operations at UNRWA's headquarters in the Ma'alot Dafna neighborhood of Jerusalem. So that's a neighborhood, it's a Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem, but it's very close to bordering. It's right next to, it's a Jewish neighborhood right at the edge of the border where the Arab neighborhoods begin. Okay, so they already, I think this is back in January. The Israelis went in there and they demolished the UNRWA buildings in the Ma'alot Dafna neighborhood, and they announced, and I love this, that on the site where those UNRWA buildings stood, they're going to build an IDF recruitment office. By contrast, the UNRWA compound at Kafr Aqab, which houses schools and medical clinics, has not yet been evacuated. About 6 months ago, security forces arrived to assess its evacuation, but came under live fire, during which a terrorist was killed. Now, what was a terrorist doing? What was a terrorist doing in the UNRWA compound? I wonder. Maybe it's because they work there. Since then, the evacuation has not been carried out. Okay, that's the story. Now, the UN is none too pleased. So let's take a look at the UN statement. UNRWA press statement on Kalandia Training Center. Here we go. Today at approximately 10 o'clock, Israeli security forces forcibly entered the UNRWA Kalandia Training Center in occupied East Jerusalem. Occupied East Jerusalem. I guess they don't recognize Israel's sovereignty. At least 4 armored vehicles entered the UN premises, accompanied by more than 50 Israeli security personnel. Approximately 20 UNRWA staff members were on the site. Israeli officials subsequently made public statements indicating that the premises had been seized by the Israeli authorities. UNRWA unequivocally condemns this unauthorized and deeply concerning incursion into the Kalandia Training Center. You know what's unauthorized? The presence of UNRWA on Israeli territory. Anyway, the entry of armed security forces into a United Nations facility without the authorization or consent of the United Nations is unacceptable. The KTC is a United Nations facility protected by the privileges and immunities afforded to the organization under international law. Its inviolability must be fully respected. Any attempt to take possession of, interfere with, or otherwise undermine the functioning of an UNRWA facility strikes at the ability of the United Nations to carry out its mandate. What would that mandate be? Is it teaching Palestinian children that murdering Israelis is a lofty act that they should be honored for and that they should aspire to? Because that's what the UNRWA schools teach. Is it maybe it's demonizing the state of Israel? Maybe it's participating in October 7th. What exactly is the mandate? UNRWA will continue to insist on the protection of its premises, personnel, and operations, and on respect for the privileges and immunities accorded to the United Nations under international law. Oh, gosh. Okay. Now, when the story gets reported this way, you might think that this was a spontaneous land grab, but this was the fulfillment of a Knesset law. Okay, a law passed overwhelmingly by the Knesset, and followed by the call this past December for the Israeli authorities to take possession of these two sites, the Ma'alot Daphna compound, which was taken over back in January. Buildings were destroyed, as I said, and this one, Kafr Akab. And the reason it's only happening now is because, as we read in the previous piece, 6 months ago, when Israeli forces first tried to move on the site, they came under live fire and had to kill a terrorist in the process. Okay. So what's going on in this site? Like, does the UN have a point? Is it possible that, I mean, is this actually kind of like in the way an embassy is? Is this UN property? Well, let's find out. Some interesting details in the Jerusalem Post coverage of this. This is from today as well. Jerusalem begins renovation at Kafr Akab UNRWA facility will become educational complex. The Jerusalem municipality began renovation work on a new educational and community complex at what has been an UNRWA facility in Kafr Akab on Tuesday, according to the Foreign Ministry. More than 40 million shekels is being invested in the initial stage of the project, including a municipal boys' high school scheduled to open next week at the start of the school year. The longer-term plan includes additional schools, a mosque, and sports, community, and healthcare facilities intended to serve thousands of Arab residents of the neighborhood. Sounds nice. I'm going to build them new sports facilities, a mosque, additional schools, except it's going to be run by Israel. The school's going to teach the Israeli curriculum because it's Israel. The Foreign Ministry said the land has been owned by the Jewish National Fund since 1937, was allocated to the municipality, and UNRWA has no property rights there. The ministry has accused the UN agency of fencing off land needed by local residents for schools and public services. UNRWA disputes that account. It says that the Jordanian government made the land available to the agency before Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967, and argues that the training center is a protected United Nations installation. Okay. Let's unpack this because this is really rich. Let me explain. The way the UN is claiming it, they're saying you captured this and you occupied this area in 1967. Before that, it was Jordan's, and Jordan allocated this land to us, so it's legally ours. What's the problem? The problem is that in 1937, more than a decade before the State of Israel was founded, this land was purchased by the Jewish National Fund. Purchased, paid for, bought, purchased. What's that about? Now, let me back up and a little education. The Jewish National Fund, what is that? It's an organization that was founded at the beginning of the modern Zionist movement. There were a number of institutions that the Zionist movement created at the time, at the very beginning. And the Jewish National Fund is exactly what the name implies. The purpose was to raise funds from the Jewish community worldwide and to use those funds to purchase land in the land of Israel for the creation ultimately of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, to purchase land. And a lot of land got purchased. And it was those land purchases that then became the initial Jewish towns and settlements before the State of Israel. Okay, the Jewish community worldwide bought tracts of land. And then when the United Nations decided to partition the land of Israel and create an Arab state and a Jewish state, the Jews accepted it. The Arabs rejected it. But a lot of how those lines were drawn had to do with what land was owned by the Jewish National Fund. State of Israel gets declared, Arab armies attack and try to destroy it after rejecting the partition plan. And when the dust settled on that war, the new state of Israel was larger. There was no Arab state because they rejected it. The new state of Israel was somewhat larger, but some of the land that was legally purchased by the Jewish National Fund was on the other side of the armistice line, in the hands of Jordan. Now, the land was never allocated to Jordan, and Jordan was never sovereign there. Jordan held it for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967, and then Israel conquered it in the Six-Day War. So now think of the absurdity of what the UN is claiming here. They're saying, Israel says, this is our land. Okay, it's part of Israel. And besides, the whole origin of this piece of land is that it was purchased, it wasn't taken away. This isn't like, the whole narrative that in the founding of Israel, they dispossessed these indigenous Palestinian Arabs and took their land away from them and expelled them. Okay, there were people who were refugees. There was all kinds of displaced people in that war. But there's also legal ownership of lands. So you want to go back to who owned it before? Jordan was an illegal occupier of that territory for 19 years. No one recognized their sovereignty there. And the UN is claiming that because the Jordanians, while they were illegally occupying that land, because they gave the UN that land, then it's theirs, even though prior to that, it was purchased, legal deed, purchased by the Jewish community, and now it's part of Israel. It's ridiculous. It's comical. Anyway, a 2022 government decision instructed the Land of Israel Authority to allocate land in Kfar Aqab for a municipal educational campus teaching the Israeli curriculum. Yes, to Arabs. The municipality has since advanced a broader plan for public and educational facilities in the area. You know what Israel wants to do? They actually want to act like a sovereign. Get these UN guys out of here, and we're going to create a school and a community facility and a sports facility and maybe a healthcare clinic. And then we're going to incorporate this into the Israeli education system. That's what they want to do. Now, I mentioned before that Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, was taking credit for this. Well, there's a member of Knesset who was not too pleased with that. Israel Beitenu member of Knesset, Yulia Malinovsky, who initiated the legislation, accused Ben-Gvir of attempting to claim credit for the operation. The work began, just jumped. The work began 5 days after she, B'Tselmo, that's a right-wing NGO that was fighting UNRWA, that was fighting to get rid of UNRWA. So she, B'Tselmo, and Yaakov Samarano, a man by the name of Yaakov Samarano, petitioned the High Court against Ben-Gvir and other ministers over their failure to implement the law. In other words, this is just a little political spat where she's saying to Ben-Gvir, you're taking credit for this? You were dragging your feet as the head of the police, as the head of the national security. You were dragging your feet on moving forward on this until I went to the Supreme Court to force you to do this. Anyway, Malinovsky argued that the petition had forced action after more than 6 months of warning, adding, without my high court petition, and if we were not in an election period, we would have continued sleeping, meaning she was attacking Ben-Gvir. Fine. But here's the key I wanted you to see. Look at this. Who's this other guy, Yaakov Samarano, who was one of the people who filed the petition to the court? Samarano is the father of Yonatan Samarano, who was murdered during the October 7th massacre and whose body was taken into Gaza by an UNRWA employee. According to footage presented by Israel, his body was later returned to Israel. Okay, that's it for that coverage. So whatever you make of the political sniping between Ben-Gvir and Malinovsky, it's worth thinking about this detail for a second. Here you have this grieving father whose son's body was taken by an UNRWA staffer into Gaza. Okay, and that father is the one who took this to court to force the closure of the compound, and it's just like this UN, the UN saying this is a violation of the immunity of the UN. Oh, yeah, where was that immunity on October 7th? Anyway, here's another wrinkle to this story, and this will be the last wrinkle we do, and I think it's significant. And it happened not in Jerusalem, but it happened in Washington, D.C. It's this. And this is from last month, folks, a month ago. U.S. congressman introduced bipartisan bill to dismantle and replace UNRWA. So what happened here is this past summer, Representatives Mike Lawler, a Republican from New York, and Josh Gottheimer, a Democrat from New Jersey, introduced a bill in Congress called the Replace UNRWA with Real Humanitarian Assistance Act. So it's a bipartisan bill. And it doesn't just cut funding the way past congressional action has. This bill directs the State Department to work with America's allies on an actual strategy to permanently wind UNRWA down with a real timeline and to replace it with mechanisms that get aid to Palestinian civilians without running it through an agency that has been thoroughly compromised and corrupt for decades. And groups like AIPAC and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies are very in favor of this, which is predictable. Critics, understandably, are raising alarms about what happens to humanitarian services in the transition. Humanitarian services, because that's what UNRWA ostensibly, and now they also do provide those things. That's the problem here. That's what's so complicated. And it's a fair question, what's going to happen to those services in the interim, but it sounds like the Israelis are looking to build some services for the people. But let's take a step back and look at the whole pattern here. 2 years ago, Israel bans UNRWA from its territory and got condemned for that on the world stage. Now today, Israeli police physically dismantling UNRWA's last Jerusalem compound, and the UN's freaking out again. And meanwhile, we have a bipartisan bill going through Congress that is legislation to phase out the entire agency globally. And then remember the Supreme Court hearing that I mentioned at the top, the one where this left-wing NGO, Adala, was trying to get the Israeli law banning UNRWA struck down. So that ended last week, by the way. The petitioners withdrew after the justices made it very clear that they were not buying their argument anymore. So no one is forcing Israel to reverse course. If anything, both the Israeli courts and the U.S. Congress are converging on the same conclusion, giving support to the Israeli government. So that's the story underneath today's headline. This was not a raid. It was not a land grab. It was unwinding. It was the beginning of really unwinding and ending a corrupt institution that basically is one of the perpetuators of this forever conflict that Israel has with the Arabs of Judea, Samaria, Gaza. Anyway, that's the story. Maybe we will finally see the end of UNRWA. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for helping grow the channel. It's really something, and I have tremendous gratitude to all the viewers. And please keep spreading the word. You who watch me on a regular basis, you know what we do here, how we read the headlines, and how we make sense of what's going on in the world. And if you find this helpful, the best way you could help me out is just share it with someone. Think of one person you know who would appreciate one of these videos and share it with them. Drop a comment. Let me know what you thought of this one. And we'll see you on the next one.